Hello, in this video I want to talk you through the setup of a virtual machine to install a Linux system in. We will use this Linux system to do computational simulations of flows, structures and fluid structure interaction using open source software like OpenFOAM for the fluid simulations, Calculix for the solid simulations, and we are going to couple that using the precise coupling library. But most of this first video is going to talk about how you get a Linux distribution set up, or how you set up a virtual machine to install a Linux distribution in. So the first thing we will need to do is we need to install VMware Player on your Windows computer. If you are using university workstations, you will have VMware Workstation Pro installed. So out of the different variants of virtualization software, I recommend for this purpose VMware Workstation Player, which you can find on the VMware website by simply searching VMware Player download in your favorite search engine. There you will find a download link for Windows where you can download that installation file for VMware Player. Once you have VMware Player installed, we can start VMware Player. This will bring up the VMware Player user interface, and we can select Create a new virtual machine. This will allow us to set up a virtual machine into which we're going to install our Linux system. Which brings us to the most important question when you start thinking about setting up a Linux system for your work, for your university work, which is, which distribution should I use? There is no clear best distribution to use, but there are a few very clear recommendations that I can make at this point. So one of the recommendations I can make is that your distribution should be a flavor of Ubuntu. Ubuntu is the most commonly used distribution of Linux in research, merely because it is a straightforward and easy to install system, and because most development of research software will be in one way or the other done on Ubuntu. And most of the software we are going to use will be available in what we call Ubuntu packages. So it's easy to install, for example, OpenFOAM on Ubuntu, and it is a bit more difficult to install it on other Linux distributions. So you go to Ubuntu and you go to the download section, we'll find Ubuntu Desktop, and I always recommend the LTS version of Ubuntu. Ubuntu has a 2-year cycle for the long-term support LTS versions and a 6-month cycle for the short-term support versions, which have more modern packages, modern kernel, modern software in it. But for scientific computing, I usually recommend the LTS version because you have to worry less about changes in that the updates may bring. So if you download this 20.04 LTS, 20 stands for the year, 04 for the month. So in 2204, we can expect the next Ubuntu LTS version to come out. So Ubuntu Desktop is usually a safe bet. However, I have another favorite distribution which I want to recommend to you for beginners, and that is Linux Mint. When you do some searching for favorite Linux distributions, Linux Mint usually comes out a little bit ahead of Ubuntu. There are some others which I won't recommend, which are based on other basic distributions. Both Ubuntu and Linux Mint are based on Debian. There is also Fedora, which is a very popular distribution, and then the most popular ones at the moment are Arch-based, but I definitely would not recommend that for beginners. And I would not recommend Arch-based distributions, full stop. So Linux Mint is geared more towards beginners and towards ease of use. So if you go here, you will find download. In this case, at the moment, it's Linux Mint version 20.2, which is based on Ubuntu 20.04 LTS as well. I would recommend at the moment, however, to go for 20.03, which is at the time of recording of this video, which is the 27th of December 2021, in beta still. However, it is supposed to be released around Christmas, i.e. right now. So when you watch this video, it is very likely that the version you get here is actually 20.3. So I'm going to use that for these videos, just so I don't have to re-record them, introducing all the changes that have happened between those minor revisions. So I download the Cinnamon edition, which has the Cinnamon desktop environment. So a Linux distribution usually consists of a kernel, which is the thing that drives the hardware. Then a lot of user-facing programs or applications. And on top of that, there is a desktop environment, which is what draws the windows on your screen, what gives you a file manager and all of that, and gives you the settings and all of that. That's the thing you see on your screen, the desktop environment. So desktop environments in Linux are very much a matter of personal preference, and there are plenty of them. Linux Mint comes in 3 different flavors. I can recommend 2 of those, Cinnamon and XFCE. XFCE is a very lightweight user environment, desktop environment, which is very popular amongst people who have a bit older hardware. So if you have an old laptop, go for the XFCE version and you will still get a snappy Linux system out of it. And XFCE is also the desktop environment that is on the Azure desktop that you have for for your use. So if you want to have the same desktop environment as on the Azure desktops, XFCE is what that is. But I would recommend Cinnamon, which is a more modern and more polished desktop. Very clean and easy to use. So if you have very modern hardware, so if you have more money than I and can afford the most modern processors, the most modern graphics cards, etc., or if your computer is very new, then sometimes these installation images won't support that hardware yet. So you can download one of the Edge versions here, and that has a bit more modern hardware support in it. But for most hardware that you may have, Cinnamon 20.3 beta is the one that you want to go for. If you have problems with hardware support, then please let me know if you install this on real hardware. We're going to install it on VMware, so that's not going to be a problem whatsoever. So downloading this, I need to select a host from which I want to download that. So University of Kent is usually quite good, but you can download from anywhere basically. But downloading that will just either you get it into a USB flasher, which is offered in this case because it knows that that is something that you usually want to do with these ISO images. Actually, this is a DVD image. So if you have a DVD player in a DVD drive in your computer, then you can burn it to a DVD as well, but typically you would put it on a USB drive to install. If you are on Windows, the one to go for is typically Balena Etcher. But I'm going to save it to a file because we're going to install in VMware. I already did that, so I can cancel that here, so I don't need to do the download again. Here we have already pre-selected Ubuntu, but I'm going to change that to Linux Mint, Mint G3, Cinnamon, Beta, ISO. The beta is because it's not yet released, but it will be. If you download that a few days later, most likely that will be not the beta version anymore. And then I can select Next. It already recognized that it is a Ubuntu type system. So it doesn't have Linux Mint in here, but it's a Ubuntu type. So let's give it a name. Let's call it Linux Mint 20.3, and we need to give it a location where it is supposed to store that virtual machine. I do recommend you store that on an external USB 3 or 3.1 if you're very modern external hard drive. Hard drive is fine. If you have an external SSD that's big enough, that's perfect. And you will get a really fast system then. But external hard drive should be plenty fine on this. So I'm going to select this here, and I have a 500 gigabyte external hard drive, and I'm going to just store that in there. The next bit is you need to tell it how big the virtual drive is going to be. So that must be smaller than your hard drive that you selected. And I'm going to give it 200 gigabyte in this case, or let's say 250, which is half the drive that I have. If you have a bigger drive, or if you want to use that drive exclusively, you can make that bigger. Split virtual disk into multiple files is useful if you want to move that later on, and if you are not sure about what the file system is on your external hard drive, if you want to use it on the university machines, I would recommend NTFS for that. So maximum disk size 250 gigabytes. Next, I want to customize the hardware. I want to give the system a bit more memory. So let's say 8 gigabytes on this machine is all right. I have 32 gigabytes in this machine, so 22 gigabytes free at the moment. So 8 gigabytes should be all right. And I want to give it 4 cores. Here you can set a few optimizations. So usually you want to tick all of these 3. However, you cannot do that before the system is set up. So if you won't get that later on, then you need to update that, set something up in your BIOS. But let's close this for the moment, and let's untick this box. So we don't want to power it on immediately, and then say finish. So that has now set up this machine, and I can go back to edit the settings, go to the processes, and activate these 2. And that makes the system more responsive because it activates Intel or AMD processors, virtualization technology, hardware support. So if you don't get that, and if you cannot activate that, then you need to go into your BIOS and activate the virtualization settings. That is different from computer to computer, but on the virtual machine, that is no problem at all. On this computer, this works out of the box because I've done that. But if you have on your computer that not clickable, then you may have to go into your BIOS and change the BIOS settings. I save that now, and in the next video, I'm going to show you how we install Linux Mint.